If China were ever to launch a direct attack on a U.S. aircraft carrier, it would mark a definitive and catastrophic turning point in global military history, triggering a cascade of retaliation, escalation, and consequences the world has never seen before. The moment a Chinese missile or aircraft locks on and strikes a United States Navy carrier group, perhaps a Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessel operating in contested waters of the South China Sea, the entire Pacific theater would ignite with unprecedented force. Carriers are not just floating airfields. They are the sovereign territory of the United States, symbols of American power projection and military dominance. The U.S. Navy will respond with immediate, overwhelming force under the principle of proportional retaliation. This will involve activating battle plans already rehearsed under classified scenarios by the Indo-Pacific Command, unleashing Tomahawk cruise missiles from Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Virginia-class submarines lurking silently beneath the waves, while F/A-18 Super Hornets or F-35C Lightning II fighters take the sky, targeting key Chinese military installations on Hainan Island, radar arrays on the Paracel Islands, and infrastructure on artificial islands like Fiery Cross Reef. At the same time, the United States Space Force and Cyber Command would launch digital warfare operations to jam Chinese communications, blind satellites, and shut down radar and missile guidance systems. But that's just the opening act. China's own response would likely be swift, deploying DF-21D or DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, often referred to as carrier killers, launched from mobile platforms deep within the Chinese mainland. The U.S., however, has prepared for such threats through its Aegis ballistic missile defense systems, distributed across destroyers and cruisers in the region, which would attempt to intercept and neutralize these missiles before they could make impact. The strike on a carrier would also trigger activation of full carrier strike group protocols, bringing accompanying destroyers, cruisers, and submarines into immediate combat alignment. If the situation escalates further, U.S. bombers B-1BS and B-2 Spirits, stationed at Guam, Diego Garcia, and potentially even from the continental U.S. via aerial refueling, would target missile bases, command centers, and naval ports along China's eastern seaboard. Meanwhile, allies such as Japan, Australia, and the UK would activate mutual defense treaties or conduct joint operations. The Philippines, depending on the location of the attack, may grant access to air bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, enabling the U.S. to rapidly deploy more forces. Simultaneously, the U.S. Marine Corps' newly formed Marine Littoral Regiments in the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions would conduct island-hopping operations using stealthy amphibious tactics, launching drone swarms and high-mobility artillery rocket systems to secure key positions across the first island chain. Taiwan, now center stage, would go into full readiness, possibly becoming the flashpoint for a broader regional war. The Pentagon would likely invoke wartime provisions, placing U.S. forces worldwide on DEFCON 3 or higher. The president would address the nation, NATO would convene emergency meetings, and global markets would spiral amid fears of World War III. China's merchant fleet and commercial ports could come under naval blockade, while its military satellites might be jammed or shot down by U.S. anti-satellite capabilities. The U.S. would also likely execute electronic warfare operations from EC-130 Compass Call aircraft, targeting the People's Liberation Army's command and control systems. Massive military logistics operations would unfold, moving additional carrier strike groups from the Atlantic into Pacific, possibly placing the USS Gerald R. Ford or USS Harry S. Truman into the South China Sea theater. Strategic bombers would deploy from Anderson AFB in Guam and Barksdale AFB in Louisiana under Operation Rapid Response, while Navy SEALs and Delta Force operators prepare for contingency missions targeting high-value installations along the Chinese coastline or disputed territories. China will be forced to choose between backing down or doubling down, at the cost of severe military casualties and economic devastation. The U.S. would leverage the full force of the Defense Production Act to ramp up wartime supply chains, bringing thousands of drones, missiles, and electronic warfare systems online within weeks. Cyber attacks would increase tenfold, targeting Chinese power grids, financial systems, and telecom infrastructure, while defending against retaliation from China's own cyber army, Unit 61398. At sea, the U.S. submarine force would play a decisive role, with Seawolf-class and Virginia-class submarines likely ordered to eliminate Chinese naval assets using advanced Mark 48 torpedoes and UGM-109 Tomahawks. Simultaneously, the U.S. Coast Guard will be deployed to secure maritime shipping lanes under Homeland Defense tasking, while NORAD increases patrols along the western U.S. coast for any ICBM threats. The U.S. Air Force would also deploy airborne early warning systems like the E-3 Sentry to maintain total surveillance over the battlefield. Chinese airfields on the Spratly and Paracel Islands will be bombarded repeatedly, while carrier-based drones such as the MQ-25 Stingray deliver fuel and reconnaissance data to manned fighters in combat. American strategic and tactical communications would be encrypted through quantum-hardened networks, while real-time data from satellites like SPIRS and AHF would guide commanders in choosing rapid next-step strikes. All the while, the world watches paralyzed as two nuclear superpowers edge closer to all-out war. Global diplomacy would race to broker a ceasefire, but the damage would already be irreversible. The strike on a U.S. carrier will become the rallying cry for Congress to authorize further military funding and national mobilization. The battlefield wouldn't just remain in the South China Sea. It would extend into the Strait of Taiwan, the East China Sea, and potentially reach the Arctic, where new U.S. and Russian interests clash in a colder, third theater competition. This is why, despite all the provocations, China has never crossed a red line of attacking a U.S. aircraft carrier. The consequences would be apocalyptic. U.S. carriers don't just represent military might. They are floating symbols of deterrence, backed by alliances, technology, and overwhelming response capability. So if China ever does attack a U.S. aircraft carrier, the response will be immediate, devastating, and likely mark the start of a war that neither side could control. It would shatter decades of delicate balance and throw the Indo-Pacific, and possibly the world, into the kind of chaos that humanity has not seen since the darkest days of the 20th century. And that's why this remains one of the most dangerous what-if scenarios in modern military strategy. In the wake of a direct attack on a U.S. aircraft carrier by China, the immediate military response would be swift and multifaceted. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command would activate pre-planned contingency operations, deploying additional carrier strike groups, CSGs, to the region. Submarines equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles would target Chinese missile launch sites, while stealth bombers like the B-2 Spirit would conduct precision strikes on critical infrastructure. Simultaneously, cyber operations would aim to disrupt China's command and control networks, and space assets would be leveraged to degrade Chinese satellite capabilities. The attack would galvanize U.S. allies in the region. Japan, under its security alliance with the U.S., would likely provide logistical support and potentially engage in joint military operations. Australia might invoke its defense agreements, offering bases for U.S. forces and contributing naval assets. The Philippines, with its strategic location, could grant access to its military facilities, enhancing the U.S.'s operational reach. NATO allies, while geographically distant, might offer political support and intelligence sharing, emphasizing the global implications of the conflict. The conflict would send shockwaves through global markets. Stock exchanges would experience significant volatility, with defense stocks surging and broader markets declining due to uncertainty. Supply chains, especially those relying on East Asia manufacturing, would face disruptions. The South China Sea, a critical maritime trade route, would become a contested zone, affecting global shipping and energy supplies. Sanctions and trade restrictions would be imposed, further straining international economic relations. Both nations would engage in extensive cyber warfare. The U.S. Cyber Command would target Chinese military networks, aiming to disrupt communications and logistics. China's cyber units would attempt to penetrate U.S. defense systems and critical infrastructure. Information operations would be conducted to influence public opinion domestically and internationally, with both sides disseminating narratives to justify their actions and garner support. While both nations possess nuclear arsenals, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction would serve as a deterrent against their use. However, the risk of miscalculation or accidental escalation would remain a concern. Diplomatic channels would be essential to manage tensions and prevent the conflict from escalating to a nuclear exchange. The conflict would have significant humanitarian implications. Civilian populations in contested areas would face displacement, and infrastructure damage would disrupt essential services. International organizations would need to coordinate relief efforts, and neighboring countries might experience refugee influxes. The attack would mark a turning point in international relations, leading to a reevaluation of global security architectures. Nations might increase defense spending, and alliances could be strengthened or reconfigured. The conflict would also prompt discussions on the rules of engagement in modern warfare, especially concerning cyber operations and space-based assets. And so, with tensions surging like an angry tide in the Pacific, the moment the Chinese military initiated its first hostile move against a United States aircraft carrier, specifically a Nimitz-class behemoth stationed deep in the South China Sea, the world stood still. Alarms sounded across every U.S. Naval Command Center as reports flashed in with terrifying clarity. Multiple DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles were launched from deep within China's mainland, their flight paths tracked by satellite in real time, slicing to the upper atmosphere at hypersonic speed. The USS Ronald Reagan, flagship of the Carrier Strike Group, immediately initiated evasive maneuvers, deploying its full fleet of countermeasures, including SM-6 interceptors from nearby Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, electronic warfare jammers from EA-18G Growlers, and the incredible agility of the Aegis combat system. Above the sea, US F-35C Lightning II jets scrambled from the flight deck with afterburners roaring, climbing to meet the enemy threat with unmatched stealth and precision. In the space of just minutes, the U.S. battle group transformed into a fortress of firepower and defense, launching a blistering retaliation of Tomahawk cruise missiles aimed at Chinese radar stations, coastal launch platforms, and suspected submarine pens in Hainan. Meanwhile, U.S. satellites blinded portions of China's GPS and targeting infrastructure through cyber warfare operations launched from Hawaii and the Pentagon's top-secret cyber division. At the same time, stealthy Virginia-class submarines already deployed in the region began shadowing Chinese Type 055 destroyers and suspected underwater drones, preparing for a first-strike torpedo launch if necessary. On land, U.S. Marines in Okinawa and Guam were put on high alert. Fighter wings scrambled from Kadena Air Base, and Allied forces from Japan and Australia began coordinating joint defense protocols under Indo-Pacific Command directives. The political shockwaves were immediate. Global markets plummeted. Diplomatic hotlines lit up from Washington to Berlin to Delhi, and the United Nations Security Council was forced into emergency session. And yet, behind every headline, the raw truth remained. This was no longer an exercise. This was war, or at least the brink of it. But if the Chinese strategists expected the U.S. Navy to fold, they were gravely mistaken. The supercarrier, though targeted, had survived the first wave. Barely. One DF-21D missile had been intercepted in the exosphere, another deflected by a dazzling series of countermeasures and decoys. Still, one struck near the bow, breaching the deck but failing to detonate fully, causing non-fatal damage but a clear sign that the war zone had shifted into a new dimension of danger. Fire crews swarmed to contain the blaze, as air crews prepared another round of F-35 sorties. Meanwhile, the USS Zumwalt, America's stealth destroyer, launched a barrage of railgun test shots at approaching Chinese drones and ships, showcasing for the first time in history the battlefield use of directed electromagnetic force in open warfare. With the global balance of power now tipping, all eyes turned to Pacific. America, wounded but not down, retaliated with a scale of precision and fury unmatched in modern warfare. An MQ-25 Stingray autonomous refueling drone extended the combat radius of the carrier-based air wing, allowing U.S. fighters to strike deeper into Chinese-held zones without returning to base. Meanwhile, an entire fleet of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers departed from Whiteman Air Force Base, cloaked under radar silence, heading toward potential command and control targets in eastern China. Their payloads were not nuclear, but massive bunker busters designed to neutralize underground missile silos and hardened radar arrays. As this second phase of conflict unfurled, the USS Ronald Reagan remained a resilient heart of the operation, surrounded by the most elite sea warriors on Earth. SEAL teams deployed via underwater SDVs, SEAL delivery vehicles, to intercept Chinese spy buoys and sabotage enemy electronics onto the sea. Further inland, the Pentagon authorized full integration of space-based reconnaissance and satellite defense, triggering a coordinated response from U.S. Space Command. Laser defense satellites targeted Chinese recon units and disrupted their early warning systems, giving U.S. forces a critical edge in the information war. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., the president addressed the nation, flanked by Joint Chiefs of Staff, declaring that while America never seeks war, it will never retreat from defending its people, its allies, or its values. At sea, sailors stood shoulder to shoulder, some repairing damaged decks, others preparing another wave of aerial superiority, knowing full well that the eyes of history were upon them. The world watched, the oceans thundered, and America, undaunted, unshaken, answered aggression with might, precision, and unmatched resolve. As the conflict intensified, the U.S. Navy's carrier strike groups, including the USS Ronald Reagan, USS Harry S. Truman, and USS Carl Vinson, coordinated a comprehensive response to the escalating threat posed by China's advanced missile capabilities. The integration of cutting-edge defense systems, such as the Aegis combat system and SM-6 interceptors, proved instrumental in intercepting incoming missiles, mitigating potential damage to the fleet. Simultaneously, the deployment of F-35C Lightning II jets and EA-18G Growlers enhanced the Navy's offensive and electronic warfare capabilities, allowing for precision strikes on enemy assets and disruption of adversary communications. Allied nations, recognizing the gravity of the situation, contributed to collective defense efforts. Japan and Australia provided logistical support and intelligence sharing, bolstering the operational reach of U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific region. The United Kingdom, aligning with the U.S. under Operation Rough Rider, launched airstrikes targeting Houthi drone manufacturing facilities in Yemen, addressing threats to Red Sea shipping routes and economic stability. The conflict's ramifications extended beyond the battlefield, impacting global markets and supply chains. The South China Sea, a critical maritime trade route, became a contested zone, disrupting international shipping and energy supplies. In response, the U.S. and its allies imposed sanctions and trade restrictions, further straining economic relations with China. Cyber warfare emerged as a pivotal front in the conflict. U.S. Cyber Command targeted Chinese military networks, aiming to disrupt communications and logistics, while China cyber units attempted to penetrate U.S. defense systems and critical infrastructure. Information operations were conducted to influence public opinion, with both sides disseminating narratives to justify their actions and garner support. The potential for nuclear escalation remained a pressing concern. While both nations possessed nuclear arsenals, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction served as a deterrent against their use. Diplomatic channels were essential to manage tensions and prevent the conflict from escalating to a nuclear exchange. Humanitarian concerns arose as civilian populations in contested areas faced displacement, and infrastructure damage disrupted essential services. International organizations coordinated relief efforts, and neighboring countries experienced refugee influxes, highlighting the broader human impact of the conflict. In the long term, the attack marked a turning point in international relations, prompting a reevaluation of global security architectures. Nations increased defense spending, and alliances were strengthened or reconfigured. The conflict also spurred discussions on rules of engagement in modern warfare, particularly concerning cyber operations and space-based assets. The U.S. Navy's resilience and adaptability in the face of unprecedented challenges underscored a commitment to maintaining maritime superiority. Through coordinated efforts with allies, technological innovation, and strategic foresight, the Navy navigated complexities of modern warfare, ensuring protection of national interests and the preservation of global stability. As the confrontation between the United States and China escalated into a full-scale conflict, the global community watched with bated breath. The initial Chinese assault on the USS Ronald Reagan, utilizing DF-21D carrier killer missiles, marked a significant shift in naval warfare. These missiles, capable of reaching speeds up to Mach 10 during their terminal phase, pose a formidable challenge to existing U.S. missile defense systems. The U.S. Navy's reliance on aircraft carriers for power projection was now under scrutiny, as these massive ships, despite enhanced defenses, faced unprecedented threats. In response, the United States activated its Indo-Pacific Command's contingency plans. Carrier strike groups, including the USS Carl Vinson and USS Harry S. Truman, were redeployed to strategic positions. These groups, composed of an aircraft carrier, guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, provide a robust and flexible force capable of both offensive and defensive operations. The integration of Aegis combat systems and SM-6 interceptors enhanced their ability to counter incoming threats. Allied nations in the region, recognizing the gravity of the situation, bolstered their support. Japan and Australia offered logistical assistance and intelligence sharing, while the Philippines allowed the deployment of the Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, MESIS, on its territory. This ground-based anti-ship missile platform, featuring naval strike missiles mounted on remote-control vehicles, significantly enhanced deterrence capabilities in Luzon Strait and Bashi Channel. The conflict's ramifications extended beyond the battlefield, impacting global markets and supply chains. The South China Sea, a critical maritime trade route, became a contested zone, disrupting international shipping and energy supplies. In response, the U.S. and its allies imposed sanctions and trade restrictions, further straining economic relations with China.